Our latest guest at the Hoover History Working Group is Kate Epstein, Professor of History at Rutgers Camden since 2011. Kate's a PhD from Ohio State, MPhil from Cambridge, BA from Yale, and the author of Torpedo, Inventing the Military-Industrial Complex in the United States and Great Britain, published by Harvard back in 2014. She's presenting to us a chapter from her new book, State Secrets, Computers, Defense Contracting, and the Origins of the National Security State. And it's a delight to be able to welcome you, Kate. I want to kick off by asking you to tell us the story of Arthur Pollon and Harold Isherwood and how they ended up in the courts, not only in Britain and the United States, trying to protect their intellectual property rights.
Sure. Well, thank you very much for having me. Pollon and Isherwood were two British inventors who came up with a fairly revolutionary system for aiming the large guns on naval ships. And they took their invention initially to the British Admiralty, hoping for really a very novel type of contract at the time, what would now be called a system development contract, although they really didn't have a concept or a name for it then. And they were able, kind of against all the odds, to get this development contract rather than what the Admiralty was comfortable with, which was a contract in which the Admiralty would agree to buy a finished product, but not to fund the development of a yet unfinished system. But then the Admiralty, or rather a British naval officer, developed his own version of their system, which had some striking similarities to theirs. And the Admiralty chose, I think on problematic grounds, to adopt this naval officer's system, which was much cheaper than theirs, but then attempted to prevent Pollon and Isherwood after it had said they didn't want their system from actually selling the system to anyone else, threatened them with prosecution under the Official Secrets Act if they attempted to export abroad. Pollon and Isherwood basically called the Admiralty's bluff. They got very high-powered legal advice, ended up taking their system abroad. And one of the navies that they took it to was the US Navy, which decided, thought about placing an order for it, but decided, having seen the system, to instead give it to an American defense contractor named Hannibal Ford, who produced a system with even more striking resemblances to Pollon's and Isherwood's. And there's clear evidence that he knew there were striking resemblances and was worried about a patent infringement lawsuit, which eventually came in the 1930s. Pollon and Isherwood sued first, actually, the US government in the Court of Claims, and then Ford himself in district court. And their suit was defeated when the US government, both in the Court of Claims and in district court, invoked what's now come to be known as the state secrets privilege, refused to turn over evidence that Pollon and Isherwood needed to prove that infringement had occurred, and they got nothing. That was quite different from what happened in Britain. There they sued the British government. It wasn't a formal lawsuit. It was a kind of complex legal forum, but in effect sued the British government in the 1920s for the theft of their system, and were eventually awarded £30,000 by a judge who was convinced of their claims that they had been plagiarized. So that's how they ended up in court.
So I guess the takeaway from this is, if you come up with a new weapons system, make sure you have good lawyers before you go anywhere near even your own government. Yes. For you, this is kind of part of a much bigger story, and I'd like you to talk a bit about that. You've talked about this as a kind of microcosm of the Anglo-American hegemonic transition, the shift of power from the British Empire to the United States, which is really one of the big leitmotifs of 20th century history. And I think you're arguing here that we can see this was not a smooth, harmonious, consensual transition, but that in fact the United States played hardball and was pretty ruthless towards Poland and Isherwood, and not only towards them, but more generally towards Britain.
Yes, so that's sort of one of the kind of major themes that attracted me to their story. I really had gotten interested in the question of the Anglo-American hegemonic transition from kind of a number of different directions, some connected with my research, some actually connected with my teaching. And I came to think that there were serious problems with how we, kind of the conventional understanding, as I take it, of the Anglo-American hegemonic transition, which I think the conventional picture is very similar to what you suggested, that it was smooth, it was relatively frictionless, it was relatively consensual. And although I don't want to dispute that there is some evidence to support that, I think it overlooks very powerful evidence that points in a different direction, which is of rivalry. That the United States not only stole intellectual property from British inventors, not just Pollock and Isherwood, but actually not just stole, but were given British technology during both of the world wars, but also stole some as well. And that helped to provide some of the material basis for the United States hegemony after World War II. But I think it was more than just IP. I think it was also the United States' efforts to develop a financial services industry, an ocean-going merchant marine, a global communications grid, and a globally deployable navy, all of which it did not really against Germany in World War I, but against Britain. And I think there's pretty powerful evidence that Britain didn't take kindly to this, and that it was a rivalrous relationship rather than a warm and friendly one.
Yeah, this is certainly music to my ears, because having been raised on myths about the special relationship, I remember finding an anything but special relationship when I was writing my history of the British Empire. And when I delved into the economics of World War II, John Maynard Keynes regards the United States as an absolutely ruthless antagonist.
Yes.
Determinedly trying to erode the power of the British Empire, which I think actually Franklin Roosevelt was temperamentally quite inclined to do. So I find this part of your work really persuasive, but there's another piece to it which identifies you as a true applied historian, and that is your kind of proposing an analogy, or at least a resemblance between the way that the United States treated the United Kingdom or the British Empire back in the mid-20th century, and the way that China in recent years has been trying to get the better of the United States. What goes around comes around. And now we're very accustomed to hearing narratives about China's theft of American intellectual property. You're arguing that actually this is just what rising powers do, and the United States used to be pretty much doing the same kind of thing.
Yes, that's exactly what I'm arguing. And again, not just with intellectual property, which I do think the United States did really for kind of the long 19th century, from the founding up through World War I into World War II, which is past the long 19th century. I think the US did sort of routinely import advanced foreign technology, not just naval technology, by fair means or foul. I also think that China has done more than resemble the United States in that regard. China has made efforts to establish a clearing system in financial services industry in ways that I think resemble the United States efforts to kind of establish New York as a rival to London during World War I in international finance. China has made efforts to build up its merchant marine in just the same way that the United States made efforts to build up its merchant marine during World War I. China has made efforts to build its navy up in a way that the United States did before and during World War I. And as Wilson sort of famously said, he wanted to build a navy second to none, and the reason he wanted to build a navy second to none was not to use it against Germany, but to basically prevent Britain from being able to boss the United States around. The United States suffered horribly from Britain's campaign of economic warfare against Germany. It was basically collateral damage to it. And Wilson did not want that to happen again. And so I think the resemblances go beyond IP theft.
Let me conclude our brief introduction to your work with a broad brush question. You were a Yale undergrad. I'm sure Paul Kennedy had at least some influence on your direction of travel into military history and the history of military technology. But are you, like Paul, somebody who thinks that powers just rise and fall in a way that's sort of inexorable? In other words, you get to the top and it's only a matter of time before somebody comes along with better technology or a stronger work ethic or whatever it is, more pig iron production, or could one challenge that cyclical model of history, which is still so popular, and say, oh, actually, if you know what to do, if you play your cards right, you can stay at the top as number one empire for a very long time without necessarily being surpassed. After all, the Soviet Union didn't surpass the United States despite promises by Khrushchev and others to do so. And Paul's conclusions in his 1987 Rise and Fall of the Great Powers, which implied that Japan and West Germany were going to rise inexorably, I mean, that didn't happen either. So how do you think about this? Is the lesson of history that you're just bound to be overtaken at some point? Or are there some ways of staying number one, even when there's a contender stealing your intellectual property?
So I don't, I suppose, subscribe to a cyclical view, because even though I would say that I have a sort of materialist bias as a historian, I do think that kind of accumulations of material power really matter a great deal. I also believe in contingency, and don't think that kind of the future is it's certainly shaped by accumulations of material power, but I don't think it's determined purely by those accumulations. It's not determined purely by material forces. So I would not care to venture a prediction on what will happen in the Sino-American relationship. It sometimes seems to me that they're just competing the US and China are just competing to see which can fall apart first, not to see which can kind of hang on longer. I mean, both the US and China just have such massive, they both have massive wealth inequality. They both have massive domestic tensions, which they're desperate to manage. They both have problems with debt. I sometimes think it's less a question of a race to the top than just not being the winner of a race to the bottom. But in terms of the broader methodological question, no, I don't think the future is foreordained. But I certainly think there has been a shift in the kind of distribution of material power between the US and China. The US has experienced relative decline. China has experienced relative rise. But I think the United States, like Britain, actually still retains, I think actually Paul Kennedy's work still retains such a grip on our imagination of kind of how we define national power. And I greatly admire Paul's work from the 70s and the 80s, which really, I mean, traces an arc from rise and fall of British naval mastery up to rise and fall of the great powers. But Paul, I think, and not surprisingly, given that kind of the literature that's now available to us on the first era of globalization in the late 19th and early 20th century. I think that model, Paul's model, thinks really in terms of industrialization and pig iron stuff, factories. But I think that the newer literature points in a different direction, which is that national power can also come from the control of financial services. It can come from the control of shipping. It can come from the control of global communications. I think they're Jonathan Winkler's book, Nexus, who was a Yale product. And so I think that although certainly Britain was experiencing relative decline in terms of industrialization vis-a-vis the United States before World War I, it was not experiencing relative decline compared to the United States in terms of globalization before World War I. And similarly, for all of China's efforts to kind of cut into the United States lead, I just wonder if we were to take that model, one which puts globalization or the power that inheres in control of the infrastructure of globalization alongside a model that focuses on industrial capacity, I wonder if we would reach a different set of conclusions about kind of the relative rise of China, or whether it would appear that the United States actually retains many latent powers over the infrastructure of globalization that China has not cut into as successfully as it has cut into the United States industrial lead, or once industrial lead.
Kate, this is all whetting my appetite to read the whole of State Secrets. Thanks for coming to the working group to share one chapter of it. It prompted a really lively discussion around the history of intellectual property rights, a subject that we at the Hoover Institution think a lot about. So good luck with the book. Don't know quite how close you are to the finishing line, but I look forward to reading the whole thing. And once again, thanks for joining us.
Thank you.